Welcome to the lecture on gender and life narratives. What is a life narrative? A life narrative can be considered as a very powerful social document as well as a testimonial to the history of women. A life narrative holds great archival value as it offers micro-histories by focusing on the individual narratives amidst the broader framework, which consequently draws a wide variety of shades on the canvas as each of the narrative stands out distinctly from the other, despite being dominated by certain common elements like the contemporary society, economy, cultural and political conditions. So, the narratives that emerge from a historically deprivileged perspective have greater validity than knowledge that emerges from a privileged position as well as perspective. So, therefore, those who are in a position of privilege are unlikely or less likely to experience different kind of discrepancies like caste, class or gender based oppression as compared to those who have been traditionally subjected to such discrimination, which often have a violent history associated with them. So, in today's lecture, I am going to talk about one such narrative, that is the writing of Rasa Sundari Devi, who was born into a society which was vehemently opposed to the idea of female education. Her time span was from 1810 to 1899, and she was a woman of her own kind at that time. The lecture intends to discuss Devi's autobiographical account, Amar Jeeban, which was the first part was published in 1876, in the context of the broader South Asian framework and how it stood out not only as a testament of the woman's position at that time, but also reflected on the struggles that women were to undertake in the time that followed, and the struggles are continuing even at the present. So, what were Rasa Sundari's concerns? As has been pointed out by Tanika Sarkar, Amar Jeeban addresses the problems beyond those that male reformers and orthodoxy were debating. So, while the male reformers and the orthodoxy were focusing on the issue of women's education or abolition of sati, the legalization of widow remarriage or a higher age of consent, and also the possibility of a higher age of marriage or the right to divorce, Rasa Sundari's concerns were a step beyond this. So, Rasa Sundari's major concerns were quite different, and all these concerns had not been frontally addressed by the reformers. So, what were her concerns? They were related to the day-to-day life, the issue of petri locality, the issue of never-ending housework, and the issue of single-handedly raising infants, the humiliations that surrounded widowhood, and so on and so forth. So, the process of writing her autobiography helped Rasa Sundari Devi to search for her own identity, for her own self in the society, while also offering a chance to critique the then society from a feminist lens. The prevalent system's disapproval of women's education is something that is reflected very clearly in the text time and again. being the first ever full-length autobiography in the Bangla literary space. Amar Jeevan received praise and welcome, especially so as it was authored by a woman with extremely restricted means at a time when female literacy was not even an acceptable idea. This clearly emerges as a voice of dissent. So, apart from this fact, what makes the autobiography a very valuable treasure is its commentary on the changing times of the contemporary Bengal and her own viewpoints on the changes that were coming about. Through the text, which at that point of time echoed the voice of dissent, in a fierce struggle of creating an identity of her own as undertaken by Rasasundari Devi herself, and also her experiences as a reflection of the inhibitions of women of her family, not only towards literacy but also towards the changes that were coming about in society. During the 19th and early 20th century, it appears that overall Indian society was kind of forcing a life of parda and veil not only on the Muslim women but also on the other communities. So we find the description of the pathetic situation of women in the novels of contemporary writers like Rabindranath Tagore and Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay, but the description is far more powerful in Amar Jeevan. So, what appears in Amar Jeevan time and again is the life of a woman who had to work with her ghungat or veil even in her kitchen. Her voice had to be lowered while talking to maidservants so that no male servant or family member could hear her voice. Even the voice of a woman was imprisoned in behind the veil. Then this appears as a document that tells us that how parda was a very important part of the culture. Centuries of patriarchal domination had normalized women into living under such practices, which they considered to be their rightful duty. This text is written in Bangla and it narrates the life story of a 19th century woman's struggle for acquiring literacy. It portrays the changing world of rural Bengal and also situates women there. About the time of the book, Tanika Sarkar has written, the book calls itself with a thundering audacity, my life. So this is a very bold statement, and in fact a householder was considering her life worth documenting. A woman who is not connected to a figure of religious or temporal significance, who cannot claim any miraculous powers, and just an ordinary householder, was kind of thinking in such terms, also needs to be taken as a revolution, and therefore it needs to be investigated as to what was happening in her mind, that she thought it very important to pen down the thoughts that were coming. Rasasundari Devi's autobiography is a testament to her determination at making herself literate despite the taboo against female education. She taught herself to read at the ripe age of 26. The most authentic source to know about Rasasundari Devi's life is her own autobiography, in which she has recorded the major events of her life in a very lucid way. So, Devi lived in times when social reform had barely touched the lives of upper caste or class women in India. Education was still unimaginable for women, and a literate woman was synonymous with a wicked or a cursed woman. But Rasa Sundari refused to remain an unlettered woman all her life. She taught herself to read and write and constructed for herself an identity which was completely independent of her husband as well as children. She not only earned literacy by sheer dedication and hard work, but also used it for self-reflection as well as self-discovery. So, one can say that here was a woman who was rebelling against the 19th century patriarchal society, because literacy was considered as unacceptable and not the norm. The old traditional women would make it into an issue if they spotted a piece of paper in the hands of a young girl. Yet her desire outweighed her societal fear. So Rasa Sundari took out a page from a religious book of her husband and stole one of the leaves on which her son used to practice writing. Then she hid these two items in her kitchen, where most of her time was spent. She tried to match the words on the leaf with those on the page whenever she was free from her household chores. And if she heard any footsteps while she was learning to read, she would hide the page and the leaf under some utensil or stove. As is written by Devi, I could read a little bit, but I did not have free time. And more importantly, the fear of getting caught and punished was always looming over me. Later on, I decided that I would read Chetna Bhagat, a religious book, in the morning when all three of my sister-in-laws were busy in religious rituals. Still, I had to read while I hid in some nook and corner of the house, as one of my maidservants kept the vigil. So we see that with such hardship and so many checks that were imposed on women, she finally found her calling and finally she achieved what she wanted to. The first part of Amar Jeevan was published in 1876. It was a historic event that a woman's autobiography was published in Bengali. Then we can also talk about some other women's writings. For example, Tarabai Shinde's Istri Purush Tulana, 1882, in which men and women were compared, and it caused great ripples in the society of those times, because this writing also was quite satirical. Then Pandita Ramabai Saraswati's The High Caste Hindu Woman, that appeared in 1887. Now both these writings were published much later than Rasa Sundari Devi's Bengali autobiography, but they are definitely very important milestones. Then from 1884, Swarna Kumari Devi of the Tagore family also got involved with Bengali literature when she started editing a Bengali literary magazine also. The first part of Rasa Sundari Devi's Amar Jeevan was written in 1868. And she was almost 88 when she wrote the second part of her autobiography, which was published much later in 1906. Jyotiranath Tagore wrote the foreword to the second edition of Amar Jeevan. He was a famous author himself and elder brother of Rabindranath Tagore. Now, if we talk about Tarabai Shinde's Istri Purush Tulna, this was a pamphlet that was originally published in Marathi in 1882. The literary work is a critique of upper caste patriarchy as well as the gender and caste system that was prevalent in 19th century India. The material can also be considered as the first modern feminist text of India, because Shinde questioned the position of women in the society and their rights. Not to miss Pandita Ramabai and her famous work, The High Caste Hindu Woman, that came out in 1887. It questioned the rigidity of a dominant faith. She brought forth how the dominant caste woman complies with her own oppression under a veil of ignorance. Then she is also made to believe that this is an honorable veil worthy of donning with utmost pride. Ramabai stressed on education as the only way out of this nexus of oppression and patriarchy. Besides education for women as a chief need, the other two chief needs that Ramabai stressed upon were self-reliance for women and the native women teachers who could communicate in local languages. So we see that Indian women were very much able to realize what was needed on the ground level. It was not English educated or English speaking teachers that were need of the hour. What was needed was to make women literate first, and for that it was very important that vernacular speaking teachers were made available, and that too women teachers were made available. Focusing on these three primary chief needs, Ramabai spoke about in contemporary times, at least for the privileged dominant caste women. These were not difficult to attain, but even they were being deprived of this. Now, a very important aspect that needs to be highlighted when one is talking about Rasa Sundari Devi's Amar Jeevan is that how the authoress was inspired by religion. So, scholars like Tanika Sarkar and Meenakshi Malhotra have observed that Rasa Sundari Devi creates the persona of a devotee for herself and presents all these small and big events of her life as a result of God's mercy or Leela, including her access to the written word. So she was truly inspired by religion, and her act of learning to read was also projected as a result of godly intervention, some kind of a divine purpose and a result of God's will and mercy. So, in her text, it is written, the prayers tend to occur before she narrates some departure she makes from given norms, so as to take away the sting from her transgression. So, as has been pointed out by Tanika Sarkar, that probably with this kind of religious sanctioning, she could kind of do away with the hatred of fellow women, and probably this kind of a religious sanction would make her life easier. There were a number of transgressions that were attempted by Rasa Sundari, as has been pointed out by Tanika Sarkar, and this also makes this piece of writing unique. So, for example, the very fact that she was writing about her personal life and she was also getting it printed to be made available to the public world. By doing this, she entered the public sphere, which was strictly forbidden for upper caste class women. A published work no longer remained a private act of writing but entered the public domain. So, major transgressions that were committed, and most of these transgressions were anti-patriarchy. So, for example, reading, writing, and finally entering the public sphere. Rasa Sundari also made a notable departure from the common patriarchal belief that female worship can only be expressed in the form of rituals like fasts or penance or cooking prasad, etc. for God. So, Rasa Sundari rejected these conventional ritualistic forms of a woman's devotion And in fact, she declared that she wanted to have an intellectual relationship with her God by being able to learn to read Chaitanya Bhagavata herself. So she chose to engage in a kind of worship where she herself was an active participant, just like her husband and other men of the family, and not a passive devotee who would not be able to read the religious text herself. Then another very different kind of notion that appears and which also shows her detachment from the household. Her assertion that I did everything in a spirit of duty is indicative of her emotional detachment from the household work. Now this statement, I did everything in a spirit of duty, everything here basically means the household work that she was supposed to do. So she was frank enough to admit that the reason she was endlessly performing her household work was not out of love or because she wanted to do that. It was only a compulsion, it was a duty, and so she was performing that. So instead of viewing labor in a very aesthetic and romanticized way, as many of the male writers of the times tended to do, Rasa Sundari deconstructed the iconic figure of the housewife in Amar Jeevan, as has been pointed out by Malhotra. So therefore we see that there are different interpretations, and if we look at Amar Jeevan from a particular standpoint, we realize that here there was a woman who engaged in a kind of worship where she became an active participant and not a passive devotee like other women in her family. Now this required lot of courage, this required lot of preparation, and it also required that Rasa Sundari should reject the conventional form of a woman's devotion. So therefore this also meant that she had to question the patriarchal social structure, and also she had to put her foot down that yes, this was the kind of path that she wanted to tread, nothing more, nothing less. So we see that there were several women who made notable departures from the common patriarchal belief that women were not supposed to read or write. And even though she could not learn literacy openly, or she could not demand that kind of a thing from her family members, but at least she kind of devised ways and means, and secretly she attained which many could not have done in their times. Thank you.